All right, you guys, so let's get started with Unit 5, Topic 4. We're going to talk about the spread of industrialization from 1570 to 1900. So if we remember in the last section, we really talked about how industrialization gets started in Great Britain. And then here we're going to talk about how it spreads from Britain into Europe and then on into the United States, and then into places like India, Russia, Japan. So that's what we're going to talk about in this section. So your learning objective in this section here, we're going to talk about how different modes and locations of production have developed and changed over time. We'll talk about rapid development of steam-powered industrial production in European countries. We'll talk about the United States contributing to the increase of the share of global manufacturing during this first industrial revolution. And we'll talk about how that affects Middle Eastern and Asian countries, and particularly India. And then we'll talk about new methods of industrial production becoming common parts in Northwestern Europe, and how those spread to the United States and to Japan. So let's get started. Let's take a look at this timeline of early industrialization. And again, remember, this is sort of to recap the previous topic where we talked about industrialization in Great Britain. So the textile industry gets its start in sort of the industrial mode right around the turn of the century, the turn of the 18th century, so 1700. And it does utilize steam power as we move into the 1700s, steam power coming from coal. And that really leads the Industrial Revolution. And remember, initially, we have rivers and canals that are the main source of transportation that link those raw materials and production centers and port cities. It isn't until around 1800, at the turn of the 19th century, that railroads, which do utilize steel for construction, coal for fuel, make transportation of goods and people much faster. Now, by 1870, as we get really out of this period, or towards the end of this period, railroad tracks, which we don't actually see here on the map, but I want you to see every piece of land that's labeled, whether it's wool production, coal fields, iron production, textile mills, all of these spots here on this map of Britain are connected by some form of rail. And rail really crisscrosses the country and links major cities and industrial areas and ports. So really understanding here how industrialization leads to this desire for further connection, and then really understanding how that promotes the introduction of the railroads, and then how that railroads then really help speed up industrialization even further. So let's talk about how industrialization spreads. Now, again, in the previous section, section 3, we talked about the beginnings of the Industrial Revolution, particularly here in Britain. And these new technologies are developed, these new processes are developed, and they spread from England, generally first to France, then on into Belgium and into Germany. And the reason why is, and if we remember back from the previous section, we talked about the natural advantages that Britain has, right? It's access to coal, it's access to lumber and things like that. So we talked about the natural advantages. And so if you look at the map here, France, Belgium, Germany, they're pretty close in geography. And so they have much of the same resources as Britain. Okay, so just remember some of those natural advantages that Britain has. And then as industrialization will spread in through Europe, right, you have inventors like Thomas Newcomb and James Watt who introduce and develop the steam engine, which converts energy from boiling water into mechanical work. And that steam engine really revolutionizes the transportation industry, really revolutionizes industry as a whole. It's a newfound ability to enable rapid movement of goods. This is where we will see trains, right, railroads, and being able to utilize steam for those railroads and to power those locomotives and trains. That also helps power ships. So it just promotes this increase in transportation. You also see steam used to power really large factories that become a huge symbol of European industry. And as a consequence, remember the consequences here, you'll see urban centers really, really take off in growth, right? The economies of these countries really grow at a very, very rapid pace. And the social fabric of the continent as a whole is going to really change as we move very rapidly from farming-based or agrarian or agricultural-based economies into industrial economies. Steam power is not just an innovation, it is a driving force. I want to kind of point this out here. It's not just an innovation, it's not just an invention. It's really a driving force behind an entirely new era in Europe, particularly in Britain, and it pushes Europe to this level of global influence that Europe had not been at before. All right, so enough about Britain. Let's talk about how industrialization finally spreads into the United States. Now, the first textile mill in the United States is designed by the gentleman below me, here, the image below me, Samuel Slater. Samuel Slater is an immigrant to the United States. He migrates to the United States from Great Britain, and he brings British textile technology with him. So when we're talking about the exchange of technological ideas, this is one key example. When we think about the spice T chart, what happens in industrialization, what technological transfer was there? Well, Samuel Slater brings British textile technology into the United States. And his textile mill, which you see a picture of there as well, is in Rhode Island. Okay, it is considered to be the starting point for American industrialization. And now Samuel Slater gets a lot of nicknames. Okay, um, the father of American industrialization, the father of the American Industrial Revolution. But in Britain, he's known as Slater the Trader, and he's a traitor. He's considered to be a traitor by the British because he takes the technology that had helped Britain become an industrial power. He takes it to the United States, and then it's going to help the United States become its own industrial power. Okay, so we're talking around 1790, 1780, 1790, so the late 18th century. So Britain had already been doing industrialization, especially in the textile industry, for nearly 100 years at this point. And so they are far in advance away from the United States. But this moment when Samuel Slater brings industrialization technology into the United States really helps spur American growth in industrialization. But so again, when we take a look at the spice T chart, make sure that you keep this one situation in mind where Samuel Slater brings textile technology to the United States. You don't necessarily need to remember his name in particular, but you need to know that British textile technology is brought to the United States from a British immigrant, from a British migrant into the U.S. And that's how industrialization gets started here in the United States. So much like Britain, of course, we see industrialization, which happens towards the end of the 18th century and into the 19th century. We really see the United States kind of grow very, very rapidly again. Okay, so this comes again on the heels of a mechanized textile industry in the United States. And then we have iron and steel production, which are greatly helped along by what's called the Bessemer process in the 1850s. The Bessemer process was a new process of making steel, which made steel manufacturing much more efficient and much more affordable. Before this, steel manufacturing was very expensive. So this helps promote a rapidly developing railway system in the United States. And that railway system, much like we kind of talked about in Britain in the 1800s, that rapidly developing railway system really helps drive an explosive industrial growth in the United States, not just necessarily as a means of transportation, but actually a driver of industrial expansion, which enables the movement of goods, the movement of people across large distances. And in the United States, it's a really important factor because the United States is a very large country, very large territory. Now, the later half of the 19th century brings about the oil industry, which is kind of moved on by the first successful oil well from Edwin Drake in 1859. And that eventually leads to the creation of kerosene, which helps with lighting and other things, the creation of gasoline. And this becomes a major commodity, something that a lot of people want in global markets. Now, this industry requires the development of lots of infrastructure to transport it. So you see pipelines being developed, railroad tank cars, taking advantage of the railway system in the United States. And then there's this oil rush that creates boom towns, which is very similar to when we've talked about gold rush towns. Populations kind of grow really rapidly, really quickly, outpacing the infrastructure that is available and leading to lots of social issues. But there is a lot of employment opportunities as well in the oil industry, which attracts workforces from lots of diverse backgrounds. There's migration patterns that change as a result of that, and how communities look. Okay, so these are the things that we're going to talk about when we talk about American industrialization, because America does have various ethnic groups that exist and live within it. So we'll talk about some of those things, but just kind of keep in mind that the production of steel, the Bessemer process, leads to a rapidly developing railway system. Then we bring along oil and gas. Oil, which brings along kerosene and gasoline. Okay. and they take advantage of that railway system. We see new development of infrastructure, including pipelines and tank cars that are driven on those railways. Okay, so this is all taking place right around, again, beginning of the 18th century, beginning of the 19th century in the 1800s, and then on into the mid 1800s in 1859. Now let's talk about interchangeable parts, which is another thing another American innovation in in the industrial period that helps really improve efficiency and the affordability of products. Now, Eli Whitney is someone who was known for having patented the cotton gin at the end of the 1700s in 1794. The cotton gin made um, processing cotton right into fabric much more efficient, and his contributions to manufacturing technology in general are probably much more transformative than the cotton gin. Okay, so traditional gun making before the development of interchangeable parts was really meticulous, really labor intensive, really took a lot of work to create and manufacture guns. So they were very expensive. Now, each weapon was handcrafted, and the parts of each gun were actually very unique and could not be easily replaced or repaired. So this limitation led Eli Whitney, who had done something similar in the cotton ginning industry, to propose the idea of what were called interchangeable parts. Now, this system would not only simplify how guns were made, how firearms were made, but would also make maintaining them and repairing them a lot easier as well, and actually revolutionize production methods across other industries as well. So in 1798, Eli Whitney secures a government contract to to manufacture 10,000 muskets. We're still using muskets in this time period. Okay. He sets up a workshop, creates machinery and processes that produce components that are so precise, right? Developing individual pieces and parts that are so precise, but all the same, um, that they would be universally compatible. Now, on the right here is the gun factory. You see kind of a painting of that gun factory, an image of that. The adoption of interchangeable and standardized production, interchangeable parts, standardized production, which dramatically reduced the time and expense that was involved in manufacturing and repairing firearms. But again, not only did we see this be used, or this idea be used with the production of firearms and the manufacture of firearms, which, yes, was a very big development, but the idea of using interchangeable parts is really a key step towards some later development that we see, which is the mass production of, say, the assembly line, the mass production of vehicles, automobiles. So remember how we kind of can try to connect some of these things and connect some of these ideas as we talk about continuities. Okay, the use of interchangeable parts, or the development of interchangeable parts, is something we will see later on down the line in the 20th century, in the 1900s, as we talk about the assembly line, okay, and car manufacturing. So just keep these moments in mind when we start to try to look at those ideas. So next, let's talk about some economic ideas here. And the first of those economic ideas is going to be human capital. Human capital is an economic term which talks about the economic value of the experience and knowledge and skills of a worker. Now, the United States has a huge workforce, which really helped it industrialize very rapidly. Now, the origins of human capital in the United States are very different. They're varied than, say, what would have happened in Britain or France or Germany. But let's take a look at where this workforce comes from. So you have, of course, native-born Americans, and when we say terms like native-born Americans, I don't want you to confuse those with Native Americans. Native Americans is more the common current term that we use for people who in this period were referred to as Indians, right? So don't confuse native-born Americans with Native Americans. Native-born Americans are rural Americans who were of European descent, who were born in the United States. Initially, they moved from rural areas to urban centers to work in factories, very similar to what happened in Britain. Now, the shift from this agrarian agricultural economy to industrial economy requires those workers to develop new skills that are appropriate for factory work. And again, same thing that we saw in Britain with British industrialization and urbanization. So it's the very same concept. But in the United States, we also see immigration. So there are various waves of immigration during the 19th and early 20th century. So during the 1800s and early 1900s, many immigrants come from Europe and Asia. They come to the United States seeking economic opportunities, very similar to why people immigrate to the United States now. Um, and those immigrants provide a vast pool of labor that's necessary for industrial expansion. Most of these people will go to cities like New York, Chicago, Boston. Some of especially the Asian population, will go to places like Los Angeles or San Francisco, right out in California, which makes sense because it's right across the ocean from Asia, right across the Pacific. And they, again, will find work in textile mills, in steel factories, and in construction, building these cities. We also see use of labor from women and children who enter the workforce in significant numbers. They would typically work in textile factories and other manufacturing industries under conditions that are very harsh by today's standards. And in a lot of cases, children were used in the Industrial Revolution and in the industry because they had smaller hands. They could get into much tighter spaces. Some of them would be used to repair machineries because they could get into those tight spaces to make very dangerous repairs. So we really do see the use of females in the industry, and of course child labor, which we'll talk about later, being outlawed at some point when we talk about the progressive era. Okay, but you also see enslaved people who are used to work on cotton plantations that feed the textile industry prior to the Civil War. The Civil War taking place right around 1860, so in the middle of the 19th century. Okay, so those enslaved people work the cotton plantations, providing the raw material both to Britain and to the United States to really power that textile industry. And then after the Civil War, when those enslaved people are freed, after the Emancipation Proclamation, those people will move north to places like Detroit, Chicago, New York, Pittsburgh. They'll move north to find work in factories. So again, we see a shift in the makeup of those communities. We see a shift in migration patterns. So industrialization will see a lot of effect on society as a whole based on those movements. So one thing to keep in mind, this is a very key point to this topic. The United States and Europe become leaders in manufacturing after the industrialization period. They are able to claim a much larger portion of the overall manufacturing level worldwide. And all of those factors that we've talked about in 5.3 and here so far in 5.4 have led to the United States and Europe controlling a large portion of global manufacturing. Places around the world that did not industrialize or maybe industrialize much later see a drop in their overall contribution to global manufacturing. So some examples, which we'll talk about a little bit later in the next couple slides, particularly in shipbuilding and ironworks and textiles, are India. Textile production in Egypt declines as well. So really keep in mind how industrialization impacts the share of global manufacturing and impacts the rise of the global economy and the balance of trade for both of these places, especially the United States and Europe, and the effect that it'll have on India and Egypt. Right? So India and Egypt see a decline in their share of global manufacturing. We're not going to go into a lot of detail here about the Egyptian textile market in this period or in this section, but it does suffer a decline in the textile industry, mostly in part for the same reason that India does, and we're going to talk a little bit about that. So I want you to think about when we talk about India's decline in the textile industry, remember that Egypt also is affected by something similar, by similar things, okay? But in theory, the British are to blame for that because they put in place really heavy taxes on both Indian and Egyptian textiles to help protect the British textile mills that are producing textiles. And again, textiles, if you've been confused, I know I've been using the word textiles. Textiles are fabrics, things that are made for clothes, linens for beds, rugs, things like that, curtains. Okay, those are textiles. So Egypt doesn't have access to coal to keep its industry afloat. That's not a resource that Egypt has. But both India and Egypt are really hurt by British taxes on textiles. And so again, when we focus a little bit on India, know that Egypt is affected by some of the same processes. So let's talk about the decline in Indian industries. Now, India has a long history of shipbuilding prior to British colonialization. So several different industries here in India go into decline while the United States and Europe gain larger portions of manufacturing and trade. India is a colony of Britain at this period, and it's largely these British policies that affect Indian industries and British intervention as well. The British will come in, particularly with the East India Company, and which we've talked about before when we talked about Indian Ocean trade. So those interventions, that in interaction with British, really affects Indian industries. So shipbuilding had been a part of Indian culture and the empire for centuries. And when European maritime trade reaches India with the Portuguese, shipbuilding grows and India develops a large navy. But when Britain comes in, takes over India as a colony, they tighten control over India, and the British get rid of the Indian Navy, get rid of a lot of the shipbuilding uh, industry that exists in India, and the Indian Ocean becomes home only to British Navy ships. So again, the Britain, the British government, sorry, disbands the Indian Navy in 1863, and the British East India Company ships take control of the Indian Ocean. But we also see declines during the industrialization period of mineral and metal mining. We'll talk about why. We'll talk about why there's a decline in firearms production. We'll talk about, of course, why there's a decline in textile industry as well. So these are the things that we're going to talk about. So we do want to make sure that we put things into some context. Okay, before we can really understand why mining and firearm industries decline in India, you want to look at some context. And for my AP students, this is really important. For my pre-AP students, this is something that might help you make some sense of why these things happen. But for my AP students, think about why something like this, and especially putting something into context, could really help you write in a document-based question or a long-form essay question. It's always helpful to point out when we contextualize the topic, so that students, you can understand when to approach context in your essays or in your short answer questions. So the British East India Company, which we talked about in Unit 4, really controlled much of the Indian subcontinent during the early part of the 1800s and 1700s. This is something that we called company rule at the time, right? It was ruled by the British East India Company. And when Britain begins to industrialize, that is who is in control of India. And in 1857, you have the Indian Rebellion, okay, which was also known as the Sepoy Mutiny. And it was a significant situation because it's fought by mutineers, right, people who are trying to overthrow the British East India Company's control. There are lots of factors that go into that, okay, and this is where context comes into play. So the immediate thing that really sparked this revolution or this rebellion is the introduction of new rifle cartridges. And again, this is talking about firearms. These are rifle cartridges that are introduced into India by the British East India Company. And there was a rumor that these cartridges of rifle cartridges were greased with both pig and cow fat, which was very offensive to the Muslim population and Hindu population in India, right? Because that goes against some of their religious beliefs of killing cows or pork or eating pork, right? So this is extremely offensive to Muslims and Hindu religious beliefs. And there's lots of other factors as well. So that's kind of the one immediate cause. But the other context is there's economic exploitation, which are the steep taxes that are in place, which disrupt traditional industries in India. You have political policies that sort of alienate and get rid of the Indian nobility. There's social and cultural interferences from Western culture that is seen as a threat to Indian religions and social structures, particularly the caste system. Then there's the rebellion itself, which was full of fierce fighting, brutal massacres on both sides, and it spreads across northern and central parts of India. But eventually, the British will come in and put down this rebellion against the British East India Company, and the British government, the British Crown, will fully take over India, and this is where India becomes a full-fledged colony of Great Britain itself. Okay, so this is some context of things that take place around mining, around firearms, and again, kind of having some idea of context is going to be helpful for you as you write some of your short answer questions. So, right, we now have the causes and some of the context. So what are the effects of the Indian Rebellion? Okay. Like I mentioned, the British Crown takes direct control of India, takes away the British East India Company. So the British government gets rid of the British East India Company, takes direct control, and this is going to usher in the period of what's called the British Raj. Now, there are, of course, a lot of effects of the transition after the Indian Rebellion, but in this topic, we're looking at how this affects industry, particularly in India. Okay? As a result of this rebellion, the British were afraid of more uprisings, and so they begin taking a look at things that they can do to prevent them because they feared more rebellion. right? So they begin to implement policies that would hopefully prevent rebellion. And so one of those is to shut down the iron mines in India, because they were worried that lead was being secretly mined in those iron mines to make bullets, right? At this period, lead is used in the production of bullets. And this really gets rid of almost all firearms production as well. So during colonial rule, after when Britain takes over in 1857, India has almost no laws regarding firearms. But after the rebellion in 1857, we get into, say, mid 1878, the Indian Arms Act made it illegal for any Indian person to manufacture, to sell, or carry a firearm without a license. So this sees declines in the mining industry because Britain shuts down the iron mines, to shut down mineral and iron mines because they're worried about lead. They make it illegal to manufacture, sell, or carry a firearm. Right before the rebellion in 1857, when the British East India Company was in control, there was really no law against firearm manufacture or sale. It isn't until the British government, the British Crown, the Queen, comes in, takes direct control, we then see the law pass, the Indian Arms Act, to make it illegal. So that shuts down the firearm industry. And so both of those industries really decline very sharply, and that has a huge effect on the economy of India in this period. Now, before the Europeans get into India in around the 1500s, India had already been producing and trading finished textiles through the Silk Roads, through Indian Ocean trade routes, and they had a very large established textile industry already. Now, when the Industrial Revolution gets started in Britain, the textile industry in Britain is really the first thing to really grow, as we talked about at the beginning of the section. And the factory system replaces the industrial factory system, replaces this putting out system. Areas that had already been known for artisan, kind of small scale textile industry become home to larger textile factories. So you have production in places like Lancashire in England, which is between Lancaster and Manchester, England. And then you also see a huge growth in cotton textiles, as there's a huge growth in demand in the 18th century for cotton textiles right as the industrial process begins. So both India and Britain, their textile industries are growing to kind of keep up with that demand. Britain, of course, using the advantages of the Industrial Revolution to do that. And at that point, Indian textile mills are in direct competition with Britain to sort of try to meet the demand of European textiles, in Europe of textiles. So textile mill owners in Britain push the government to put in place a tax on Indian textiles to really kind of limit that competition from India. And so there's this particular fabric that's produced in India called chintz. It's very light, it's very colorful. You see an image there. And it was in high demand in Europe. And to really kind of push the textile industry in Lancashire, Britain would completely ban the importation of chintz into Great Britain. And what that meant was that the mills in Lancashire could try to fill that need with the newly developing textile industry and textile technology, while the Indian industry really had to sort of kind of be crippled and be ended in a lot of ways. And the British impose a lot of hefty taxes on most Indian textile imports, some of them as high as 85%, which make it nearly impossible for those mills to be profitable. And again, keep in mind, in this period that we're talking about, not only were the Indians, and again, when we say Indians here, we're talking about people from India. Not only was India part of or under the control of the British East India Company, but later on would be under direct control from the British government, from the British Crown. It is a full-fledged colony. So keep in mind, Britain is doing this to India while at the same time maintaining really strict control over India as a whole, which we talked about a little bit. So while we've primarily focused so far on India losing a share of manufacturing in this period, I also want to make note that we are talking about specific industries in India that went into decline: shipbuilding, mining, firearms, textiles. But it is important to keep in mind that India does see really a huge push to build a railway system beginning around the 1830s. And the first trains are freight trains, cargo trains, which are primarily used to haul construction material and raw goods and things like that. The first passenger trains open in India in 1853. Now, the map on the slide, the dark blue lines, those are not roads, those are railroads. Okay. So you can see kind of the expanse, how widespread the use of railroad is in India. And today, India has the fourth largest railroad network in the world, and it is used by so many people in India. India, of course, has a very large population of over 1 billion people. So today, India has the fourth largest railroad network in the world. So now let's move into Japan, right, in Asia. Japan and industrialization. We've talked a little bit about the exclusion of the Portuguese in Unit 4. If you remember, under the Tokugawa shogunate, we talked about the Sakuku edicts, okay, um, which really helped block European powers from coming into Japan. So again, kind of looking at the slide here from Unit 4, we talked about how Christianity is introduced into Japan in the 1540s. The spread of Christianity is seen as a threat in the 1610s. And then right around 1639, the Sakuku edicts exclude the Portuguese, okay, from trading in Japan. And then in 1640, a Portuguese ship tries to convince Japan to open trade again, and the ship is burned while 61 men were executed in Japan. So Japan in the 1600s really closes itself off to Western powers, right? It sees Christianity as a threat. It sees this influence and interaction with Europeans as a threat to their power and a threat to their culture. So recall from Unit 4 that we see relative isolation in Japan. Japan kind of closes itself off to Western influence, okay? The Dutch are an exception. They do have some interaction with the Dutch as a whole, right? But generally speaking, they don't trade with Western powers at all. Trade is limited, right? So what that results in is a limitation on the transfer of ideas and technology. So again, when we talk about the Spice Tea chart, this is something you can talk about. Technological transfer is low in Japan because they closed themselves off during this period, and they closed themselves off for nearly 2 centuries. Okay, so for industrial techniques and technologies to come to Japan from Europe during this period of industrialization, something has to change, right? Japan is experiencing a isolationist policy. It is isolating itself from the world, and the rest of the world is moving on, and the rest of the world is really, really booming in its economy. We're seeing a lot of development and industrialization, and Japan is really getting left behind at the beginning here. So we'll see how that changes during this period. So in 1853, Commodore Matthew Perry arrives in Japan with a fleet of U.S. Navy ships. You can see them in the background there. This image here is a painting that depicts the arrival of Commodore Matthew Perry in Japan. So you can see the ships on the back. So these are so-called black ships with very superior technology, very superior armaments and guns, which really showcase the West's military and technological advancements. So it's a shock to the psyche of the Japanese, and it's a shock to the system, right? You can sort of see the comparison there. You see the very well-lined American troops with their nice guns and things like that, and then you see that compared to the Japanese, right, and their system that they're displaying there. So again, remember that Japan had been isolated from most of the rest of the world for just over 2 centuries under the Tokugawa shogunate. Okay, so just imagine what the reaction would have been to seeing a fleet of ships like that, right, roll up into harbor, and then this group of soldiers, which really, again, puts on display the military and technological advancements that the rest of the world, particularly the West, particularly the United States in this case, had been making while Japan had closed itself off to the rest of the world. And keep in mind, we're just about 100 years now, 1853. We're just under 100 years when Japan will fight against the United States in a world war. We'll get to World War II as we go. But the United States does try to come to Japan to open them up to Western trade. So let's take a look at how that transpires. So Commodore Matthew Perry comes to Japan in 1853. He's working with the Japanese, negotiating with them to try to open them up to Western trade. And so in 1854, we finally see the Treaty of Kanagawa with the Tokugawa shogunate, which ends Japan's isolation and opens up ports for American trade and establishes a consulate in Japan for the United States, right? So this is a way for the United States to really promote its interests in Japan. Now, that treaty would be followed by similar agreements with other Western powers, but one of the things that it does is it leads to internal conflict because there really was no consultation with the emperor of Japan, and if we remember back to the unit where we talked about Japan, the shogunate really ran things day to day. The emperor was still in charge, the emperor was still around, but the shogunate was really responsible for running the show day to day. And then you had the daimyo, the nobility, which were underneath the shogunate. Okay, so they didn't consult the shogunate didn't consult the emperor before opening up Japan. The shogunate didn't consult with the daimyo, the nobility, and so the daimyo, there's a lot of internal dissatisfaction, right? They feel disrespected, they were dissatisfied, and there were a lot of people who saw this as a sign of weakness, right? The treaties were perceived as unequal, right? They felt that they were very beneficial to the Western powers, but not beneficial to Japan. They felt it compromised the sovereignty or the integrity of Japan as a whole. And so that fueled discontent among the population, particularly among people who are nationalist forces, who support the emperor. We talked about nationalism when we discussed revolutions earlier in this unit. So this leads to a power struggle between the shogunate and the daimyo and the emperor. So there's this anti-shogunate sentiment. There's this then rebellion, which is called the Meiji Restoration in 1868. And this led to restoring the emperor to power, right? Taking the power away from the shogunate, putting it back in place with the emperor, culminating in this restoration. And this event abolishes the feudal system. So we get rid of the daimyo, and the feudal system marks the beginning of Japan's rapid industrialization and modernization. So they make use of the technology that's been brought by the Western powers, but they will take it to their own advantage at this point, right? And industrialize themselves. So Japan becomes the first Asian country to industrialize and becomes an industrial power in its own right, Taking advantage and taking use of the technology that was brought through those treaties with the shogunate. Now, briefly, I also want to touch on Russia. The Industrial Revolution does eventually spread into Russia, but one of the things we want to keep in mind, which we've talked about when we talked about the Cossacks, when we talked about Catherine the Great and such, is that the feudal system doesn't end until much later in Russia, right? Keep in mind that it was almost 100 years earlier, a century earlier, in the 1700s, that the feudal system ended in Britain and much of Europe. Serfdom and feudalism doesn't end in Russia until 1861. To put that into some context, into some perspective, the United States is fighting the Civil War. So the United States has been a country for nearly a century by the time the feudal system ends in Russia. So Russia is very far behind, or further behind than other countries. So for some sort of industrialization to occur, we have to see capitalism come into play. And we'll talk about capitalism later in 5-7. But the end of serfdom comes much later in Europe, right? The ideas from the Enlightenment, several revolutions in Russia take place and make their mark on Russian society. Serfdom is abolished, and that is a key factor in opening Russia up to industrialization. The factory system needs workers who are not tied. If we remember back to what influences industrialization in Britain, it's the fact that people move from the country, from rural areas, from farms into cities to work in factories. So in order to have industrialization, you cannot have a workforce that is tied to the land. And until a period in 1861, serfs in Russia are tied to the land. They cannot go to the cities to work. So we don't see industrialization happen until that period. So industrialization is very uneven, though, in Russia, right? Some regions are able to form industrial economies much easier, and others are much more agrarian still. So keep in mind the differences in something that we'll talk about a little bit later is some of the differences that happen in Russia, and some of the differences in their topography, their geography, their climate, things like that, really play a factor in how they're able to industrialize. Okay, so industrialization begins in the late 1800s in Russia. Coal, iron, steel, copper, those oil industries grow really rapidly in that period. But Russia does not catch up to Europe in this period. Okay, you have very harsh terrain. You can see a picture of that here, right? Let me try to highlight that with my mouse. Give me one moment, right? You see some of that terrain right here, right? Very harsh, very bleak, very, very tough land to make transport connections, right? So using the railroad is very difficult because it's very difficult to build. Okay, they would not begin construction of the Trans-Siberian Railroad until the 1890s, 1891 to be exact. And remember, right, what one of the advantages that Britain had, and one of the advantages that parts of Europe had, and one of the advantages that the United States had, is their ability to use rivers and canals to connect cities. That does not necessarily take place here in Russia, because for 4 to 5 months out of the year, nearly half of the year, remember, Russia's climate is much colder. They are much further north than Europe. They're much further north than parts of the United States. So for 4 to 5 months out of the year, those rivers are frozen and frozen solid. So you cannot use boats or ships to ship things. And then that climate, the cold climate, makes building railroads very difficult as well. So Russia's economy will remain mostly agricultural until after 1900. So even though the feudal system, even though serfdom will end in the mid 1800s, in 1860, it's not until probably 40 to 50 years later that Russia really starts to get out of that agrarian economy and really start to industrialize on its own right. So just keep in mind some of the things, geography, interactions with the environment, really, really have an effect on how Russia industrializes, and really explain some of the inequalities that we'll see in Russia, and some of the sentiment that's seen still even today in Russia. So we'll talk about that as we continue throughout. But some of the key things to review out of this section. So remember how industrialization begins in Britain, then spreads into France, Belgium, and Germany, who have similar natural resources. So again, keep that in mind as we think about continuities. What is one of the things that is continuous between Britain and the other parts of Europe where industrialization spread? And it's their similar natural resources. Talking about as well how industrialization spread to the United States, beginning with the textile industry and how that textile technology was basically taken from Britain to the United States. How we talked about steel, oil, interchangeable parts, human capital, how that is really a unique part of American industrialization. What changes that had on global manufacturing, with Europe and the United States becoming an increased power in that level, and how that affected the Middle East and Asian countries such as Egypt and India. We talked about how there was a decline in Indian industries such as shipbuilding, mining, firearms, and textiles, due in part to British rule and British colonialization and taxation. And we also talked about Japan becoming the first Asian country to industrialize. And we just spoke about how Russia saw growth in certain industries, but remain largely agricultural, and why that takes place as well. So those are some of the key things to review out of this section.